Okay, hey Shawn.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Okay. Um, so hi, I'm here to talk about Egyptian hieroglyphs, and a little bit about the writing system and a little bit about what we can actually do with it with respect to a specific type of writing. So I encourage you to ask me questions, though 95% of the time people will focus on something that I know nothing about, and I will tell you that I can look it up, or I can direct you to where to learn more about it. But the visuals end up being so complicated that there's a million possible questions. But I do encourage you to sort of interrupt with questions as we go. Um, so this is what we're going to be looking at, this type of object. Um, so people have sort of misconceptions about how Egyptian hieroglyphs work. So if you just saw this object, I wonder what people would think about it. Does anybody want to sort of volunteer? Just what do they imagine this is for?
Historical record.
Okay, that's a safe answer because in a sense they're all records. Anything based on like the types of pictures that you can see there? This
Well,
is not a
okay,
fair question.
right, all right. So we see there's the one big central person, right, with the other sort of secondary person,
Yep,
right, which seems to be a woman, right? Secondary, like a wife or daughter or something, right?
exactly. Yeah.
But then we have a bunch of pictures, like in like where he's the direction that he's facing, which look like food, maybe like fish and plants and stuff sitting in. So, one temptation that I would have would be to be immediately thinking of this in like a pictorial narrative kind of mode, like, oh,
That's a good way to
like
think of it.
is he going to a feast or something, or like is that what's happening, is that like part of the setting of this story that I'm seeing? I mean, my impulse would be to try to interpret it like I'm looking at like a stained glass window or something, you know.
So I think stained glass window is a good way, or even almost like a scene from a graphic novel or comic.
Right.
Sometimes the things are happening simultaneously, sometimes they're not. But you are on the right track. That is as a man with his wife, and that is a scene of all types of food. And in this particular case, this is one of the rare cases, not rare, but one of the types of cases where the pictures actually represent what they are. That is a feast, basically. It's an offering formula for this person who's deceased. And it's a sort of ritualized or standard way of presenting this information to make an offering so that this gentleman will have food in the afterlife. So these are all the things that he wants. So he wants fish and bread and beer and all of these objects. The reason I ask this is because people often try to look at the hieroglyphs and they see, well, there's a lot of birds in there. Are they talking about birds or snakes or scorpions or whatever? So I want to talk very briefly about the writing system before we go into the text, this type of text. If we look up really close, right, we see all of these little symbols, birds, little things for water. Some objects we recognize, many we probably can't until you're told what they are, and then they become more obvious. And then down here, like where you sort of focused, that's where the objects become a little bit more ornate. They become a little bit more clear as the objects that they represent. And this is a complex issue in Egyptian, right? Because words are sort of both used as text, and they're these sort of they're meant to be pictures of things to tell stories. So what I want people to take away from this, hopefully, is that they can recognize one of these types of stela, what's called a hetep dinesu stela. You can kind of look and see these standard parts that are included, and you can also see how visually complex this stuff can be. Both, it's sort of templatic, but at the same time, like there's a million little changes. So let's take a quick look at the language. So, any guess as to what that is? These are unfair questions, I realize sometimes.
It's a box.
It is a box. It's an Egyptian house from above.
Oh, from above.
Yeah, that's their sign for house. So that is an Egyptian, that's a hieroglyph. So that's a sign that you could find in a million texts, and we'll actually see it over and over again. Egyptian was not just ideographic. It wasn't just pictures of objects. It was mostly phonetic. It was mostly about the sounds that these things represented. So it could be a house. So here we have this ideogram, meaning house, and has a little dot under it sometimes when you want to represent the item it actually is. And it was just PR. That's how we put it into sort of English, or transcription rather. And it just means house. And we have a little picture of legs there. So when we want to talk about legs, we might just draw a little picture of legs like that. If we want the sound it means, and that's the more common thing, it just means that the combination of characters or letters PR. Most of Egyptian is like that. We could go over the sort of top 30 characters, and you could kind of write out in a Roman alphabet most of what every text says. These ideograms were less common, except in the texts I'm about to show you, in which case the pictures are kind of important. And the last thing is these little words, or these little symbols, come at the end of lots of words to let the reader know what you're talking about. So they might have an ambiguous word that has the letters PR in it, or the sounds PR. And we need to know, are you talking about the purr that's a tree, or the one that's a house, or the one that means to walk? So this will get tacked on at the end to let the reader know this is the sort of semantic category we're talking about. So that doesn't get represented in the spoken language, but it gets written all over the place. So there's like 50 different little determiners that you could get to add. And it's kind of fun because the words change based on these little pictures at the end. So in this case, we have a picture of a house, but we actually just want it to be the sounds PR. And then we have the little legs as a determiner to let us know, oh, that actually is the word ascend. So right there, that's the very brief introduction to the language that you get. So they can be ideas, they can be sounds, they can be pictures, just to let you know the sort of topic that we're talking about. And now we're going to jump in. If you have questions about this, or as it shows up in what we're looking at, please just ask.
Okay, I actually have one really quick question.
Oh yeah.
So the legs themselves, they're the determiner?
In this case, they're the determiner. They are telling you we're talking about movement, human movement. So going up or down or running or like walking, all of them are probably going to have some sort of little leg thing. And these determiners can be really they get kind of funny in a way, or interesting. A little bird might mean evil. So all the different bad things have a certain type of bird that shows up at the end of the word. Or if you're talking about enemies, it's always a guy who's hitting himself in the head with an axe, because you also can't represent an enemy being successful. He has to be losing. So there's all these little pictures of guys hitting themselves in the head with the axe. So some of them they're kind of funny. And then, so there's a variety of them. So you can have a leaf or a tree, or the little legs.
So how do you come to figure out, so that if you have the little legs, which are so I can kind of conceptually see how the little legs suggest motion, like personal emotion, as you say. But how do we know? How do we get from house to ascend? Is it just like context? We figure that out, or?
Yeah, and I know that when you start the language and people say context, it sounds very frustrating to a learner, being like, right. You've basically told me all of my questions will be answered in the future by context. Context is this magical thing that will. But eventually, especially with a standard text like this, you'll just know that they have to be talking about this thing and not these other options. But when you're dealing with new texts, that gets confusing, and you really have to look at your options and see, is he most likely talking to a building or a person that works in a building or something like that? Right. But it's a challenge. They're puzzles. They're complex puzzles in a way. So here's that image again. So I'm just going to sort of focus on a few parts of it. Actually, I'm going to skip over this image, and we're going to just sort of jump to the parts of this. So this Hetep Nesu, that's the way everybody calls it. It's an offering formula, or it's an offering which the king gives, or sometimes translated as a royal offering. And it's made up of 4 parts. So we're going to see a bunch of these parts in example pictures. So that's what I'm mostly going to do, is show you a bunch of pictures with different little things highlighted to let you sort of see the different ways that this happens. The point of all this, or I guess the sort of one of the other takeaways, is that It's standardized, so it's easy to recognize, but each little part is complicated within itself. And we don't have time to sort of go over that, but that's the kind of thing that as you learn the language, you learn how to pull apart these things. It's heavily abbreviated. It's like reading somebody's texts where you understand all of the nuances of the things that they abbreviate and the way they speak. And there's a little picture. This is what we're looking for. It is this little plant, a half circle, a little scroll that's wrapped up, and what looks like a little tall pyramid. And that's the image that we're going to see over and over. And there's an actual one that's carved. So actually, I was going to ask you guys a question, but I gave away the answer here. These are these offering formulas, right? So we're dedicating an object or food or something on behalf of somebody. And we list who we're doing it for. We're listing who is doing the offering because somebody's working on our behalf, and we're listing what we're giving. And the interior parts of these can get sort of complex, so we're not going to worry about that stuff yet. But so here's an agent. So we have this offering that the king gives, and now we have this little picture of what is a throne, an eye, what looks like a half circle, a little, looks like a tower with some lines across it. This is who is doing this. So in this case, it's Osiris. I can't see all of my screen because my cursor disappeared. I don't want to go forward. The problems of technology. But so we going to be able to easily spot this part in most of our texts, even though we won't always be able to tell who it is because you might need a dictionary, a 900-page dictionary to list all of the entities in the Egyptian sort of cosmos that could be doing this. But generally, it's going to be Osiris or Anubis or something like that. Here's a list of the offerings, and this is a little bit more clear. We see that little house again, and we also see some other symbols underneath it. One is a piece of bread. One is a little thing of beer. Beside it, we see the head of an ox, the head of a bird. And then these other pictures get a little confusing. One is actually meant to be alabaster, and one is meant to be clothing. And then after that, we have an expression, all good things. So we're giving bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, linen, and all the good things. And then lastly, this is who it's for. In this case, we have two things. So one is we see that squiggly line, and then the half box, and then a squiggly line again. I'm sorry, I can't highlight my screen better. That's an expression that says for the ka of. The ka is their spirit. So the first little squiggly line is just a sign for water, but it's also the letter N. And in the letter N in Middle Egyptian, it's just a preposition that says for or of. So we have for, and then we have the little ka sign, little spirit, and then of again. And then we're going to get a name. Sometimes we have this little ka sign, sometimes we don't. It's great when you do because it's almost always that the next thing you find is going to be the person's name. If you don't have it, it's harder to find their name. And this is Imhotep, I believe. And so these are the items that we're looking for. I'm going to highlight each one, and we're going to see sort of the varieties of them. And then I should also warn you that these are all abbreviated themselves. So that little sign there, or that combination of signs, is actually what we call the Perteru form. It's a voice offering, and here's all the different parts of it if you wanted to really sound it out and wanted to understand it. But an Egyptian or an Egyptian translator is so used to it, they come along and they don't really focus on all the possible parts. They just sort of treat it as its own unit. Any questions so far? This is like the whirlwind tour of Egyptian offering formula. The benefit of this particular thing is these are the ones you see in museums. So all of my examples, I think, come from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, but you can find these in every museum, and they're like the most common thing, which is great because you can go there and you can be like, oh, I can read most of this. So here we are again. So here's another one.
Question.
Yeah, sure.
Ancient Egyptian, is this read from right to left or left to right?
That is a great question. That is one of the many aspects of writing that I skipped. It can be written in any direction the scribe wants to. You know which way to read it because characters should face you when you're reading. They are sort of polite and they look at the reader. So you can go sort of, what is it, boostrophonic. You can go up and down, left and right. And then there's all types of subcategories where you reverse it because you're like trying to trick somebody or other motivations for it. But you just have to keep in mind the direction that like an object like with a head, which way they're facing. What is also challenging is recognizing up here in the left where to actually start, because there's two different sets of text here that come right side beside each other. If you look, there's a series of little dots that the scribe put in to make it easier for you to tell what should be separated. But on the top line, they don't do that. But we know that we're looking for that little plant. So we see that plant there. So we know we're going to start mostly towards the left top. I really want to be able to use my cursor to point. I cannot. So I highlighted the different things here. So that's that hetepti nesu form, an offering the king gives. And I actually highlighted these ones, or I took these already, so you've seen these. And then that's Osiris, the Lord of Abidos. And then it's a list of the things that he gives for the ka of this Imhotep. And the part that's not highlighted there is the guy's job. He is an overseer, I can't remember, of the chamber. There are thousands of jobs in the Egyptian bureaucracy. So you need a separate dictionary just to look up jobs sometimes. There's separate dictionaries for several different topics. But there's lots of interesting jobs. But I just didn't bother because sometimes they say the job and sometimes they don't. And then the black highlighted section there is a sort of reminder of the things he's giving. He's kind of rewriting. The scribe rewrote a few of those items. And he threw in the word there for 1,000. He's letting you know he's giving lots of these. They like to put 1,000 at the beginning. So here's another of these texts. But now we have a better idea what to look for. So where do we start with this one?
I admit I'm looking around for houses. Okay.
This one, well, for the house will come a little bit later. The first thing we want is that little plant.
Oh, that's top left, right?
Top.
Is that a little?
Oh, there's a little plant on the top left too. In this case, it's the top right. The plant we're looking for is top right.
Right. I see the set there. Yeah. Okay.
The one on the top left is actually the word for 1,000 again, and it's the beginning for the next line. So we have the same formula here. So we can figure out, well, there's the hetepti nesu. There's a very similar looking pattern for who it is, the god Osiris. Then we go to the next line, and we don't actually have that little house. For some reason, the house is missing, but we see the other elements. If you look closely, you can see a head of a bull maybe and a duck, and you see that circular object. Everything in orange, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that thing again. Now we have the little ka thing letting us know a name is coming up. There's the line ka and another squiggly line. In this case, they're adding in a few more pieces of information, and then they get to the name. Unfortunately, the name is spread across different lines going in different directions, of course. So this guy is called, I want to look this up to make sure, because sometimes they get sort of translated so often, starting from 2,000 years ago, we say it a certain way. So that's Sarin Utet. Sarin Utet, and we start with that duck, and then we have that little mouth sign, two of those little squiggly lines, we move to the vertical. And then we keep going down and we get his dad. So that's Sarin Utet, son of Bamaket. So this is a more complicated one. We've switched directions. We're kind of sort of trying to keep track of everything. But we also see the rest of the sort of normal image here, the big pile of food. This is nicely carved. Everything sort of within its proper place. There's plenty of them that we'll see that don't do that. Here's one that's a little bit, I'm reluctant to say cheaper. It could have been done during a different period. There's a variety of things that could be happening, but it certainly looks like the scribe was not of the ability of the last person. But it's still kind of nice. And in a way, I think that these ones are sort of more interesting because they show a little bit more about what closer to average people would be like, though my guess is your average person would not be able to afford any of these items. These are people that actually have some money, which is probably not the bulk of the people at that point. But if we zoom into the bottom here, we see those same elements. And there's certain elements that are really repeating. That this Heteptinesu is pretty much the same every time, except here the elements have been reversed a little bit. And there may be a reason that one could try to justify and maybe not. And then we have who it's sort of being offered on behalf of. And then we get down to the orange where we have the list of items again. In this case, we've skipped the alabaster and linen. We have those three little dots, which is their way of making things plural. You can either write three heads in a row or you can put three little dots afterwards and now you know it's plural. What you also get is that all things good and pure, which is nice. And then you've got this ka thing at the bottom. And this is Merenhetep. That's the name of the guy at the top. So after only a few of these, you begin to realize the pattern's pretty standard. There's lots of pieces in between that you might need to work on. You have to figure out, well, what type of job was this? What extra information are they giving? But you can, with a few of these, begin to figure out where to start, the direction things are going, a few of the more common words, and some elements like that. And you can see variations too, in sort of what you imagine the cost of this might be, and the importance of the job, because sometimes people have lots of jobs listed. And your sort of standard introductory textbook will give you the main things to look for that you can find on these. So you don't actually have to have that huge dictionary of jobs. You can have a list of 20 or 30 jobs that are more common. So here are elements again. They cross over from one line to the next. But we can see that, okay, so a lot of these are going in the same direction. This one is a little bit harder to see. It looks like some pieces maybe got sort of chipped away. But now that we know the formula or the kind of standard, if we can only see half of something, we can usually guess what is missing, or at least up to some extent. So just like any other sort of ancient language, if something's kind of maybe a little hard to read in a very old manuscript or an inscription somewhere, we can start to predict the types of things that we would expect to see.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What usually is the relationship between the text and the image? Like I notice each one of these has like a big dude, right, in the middle of it. Which one is the dude? Is the dude the one on whose behalf the gift is being given, or is it the one to whom the gift is being given? Or
so this is a debate that's been going on for about 100 years, I'd say. Okay. Nobody actually knows. As common as this is, there's 1,000 examples. It kind of emerged already solidified, and the underlying structure isn't entirely clear. It is an offering. They say an offering the king gives because the king represents everybody. Okay. So all good things that people do sort of go through the king. Now he's making an offering, and it's not entirely sure whether or not he's really if he's sort of giving this to Osiris, or if Osiris is helping the king.
Right.
And those are debated. People take both sides. But generally we do know that the person whose tomb or like was buried around here, they're the beneficiary in the sense that they want people to read this. When somebody reads this, they enact, they affect the magic. the words have magic, voicing them has magic, and that magic feeds them in the afterlife. So tombs rarely actually had curses. They have curses and things like that to say, like, well, don't disturb the body, but you're still welcome to come here and look at the material, because it's your presence that helps us in the afterlife. So they wanted visitors. In fact, there's stories about people picnicking in their relatives' tombs and things like that. But so yeah, so the answer is nobody really knows except for certain parts of it. So yeah, that's an issue.
Yeah.
But the benefit of these is because they're so standard, a lot of it is still sort of more easily explained, like what the objects are, what the pictures are. So it's a good place to sort of start, because you see these objects all over the place in museums. You can look, and it's very clear when you're talking about oxen and birds and alabaster, things like that. And a lot of these words are fairly common. So those, I'm going to skip ahead. So this is a guy that had, a very fancy job. The bulk of this text is, sort of outside of the realm of what we're talking about. But you can see in the corner, if we sort of zoom in, you're going to see the elements that we're looking for. I realize I got like 1 minute here. So this is just a tiny portion of the text that's out there. This is like one of the types of things that Egyptians would talk about, in addition to a myriad of other things, from magic spells to sort of historical things, and stories and boundary stela. But this is a good place to start when you're trying to learn more about the basics of the language and sort of how to approach it, how to start learning the signs, what you can do with them. And like the question before, the complexities just of writing this way. Half of your initial study for Egyptian is to make sense of how to use the hieroglyphs. The language itself isn't that complicated, a Middle Egyptian itself, but the writing system they used has a lot of variations. So it's a good place to start. And so let me just jump ahead. And it's not always men. This is a stela for 4 women. They don't really know who, they believe it's like 2 mothers and 2 daughters, but as to why they're grouped together, we don't know. But still the standard formula sort of applies there. And this is just a sort of an image of all the ones that we looked at and how similar they are, even though these span hundreds of years and this formula spans about 1,000 years. In this particular case, we see this regularity that just gets perpetuated, and that makes it sort of fun to learn about and to read. And then we just have these sort of ones that get harder. The sort of takeaway here is that you'll start, if you look for those plant forms, you're going to notice them all over the place now if you're looking at Egyptian stuff. And you have a basic idea, like that this is a formula that is to perpetuate or to give these items for somebody in the afterlife. But how to go about studying that is, I guess that's the next step.
Yeah. So talk a little more about that. Tell us like the kinds of things that like what happened in the first Egyptian hieroglyphics module.
So the main thing that you start to do at first is there's about 40 characters or signs. You would do like the first day. You'd sort of learn the basic letters and the order that they can go in and how you can rearrange them depending on certain things. You put important people's names first, even if that's not the first element. So in this case, we keep saying that it starts with that little plant. That's not the first word that you say, but that's the word for king. So he comes at the beginning either way. So you learn that sort of material. And it only takes a few days of looking at this material before you can actually start to, where to start, how to make your way through it. And then you learn how to look things up in a dictionary. And then you start to learn the more complex signs. And all the while you're doing this, you're starting to apply them to simple scenes so that you can get a good taste of how some of these scenes are represented. So you jump right into the hieroglyphs immediately, and the language study sort of accompanies that in a way. So it's sort of picture driven in a way, which I think for a lot of people is easier to remember. It's kind of fun because you can, after the first day, you can start to write your own name, you can start to write your own sentences, things like that. You can write little cryptic notes to people or mysterious notes in hieroglyphs. And then you work your way through just like any other language. They have verbs and nouns and adjectives, and you have to learn the order they go in. They conjugate their verbs. So people that are used to studying languages like Latin, or Greek, or Spanish, there's a bunch of forms that you'll have to learn. But they're fun because at the ends of each of these words, you have a snake or a bird or something like that. So in a way, it sort of maintains visual interest the whole time, I think.
So Matt was asking on the Twitch channel, in the Egyptian context, are these things like the offering formula that we've been looking at, are they spells or prayers or something in between, or?
That's a great question. And it's really hard to say because the Egyptians didn't have a word for religion. They did have ideas about magic, but there was no distinction between natural world and magical world. They were one and the same. So they acted like magic in the sense that a non-Egyptian would think, well, that's magic. But to an Egyptian, they were just the cause and effect. The sort of the connection between there, whether or not it's physics or magic, was not important. So there are lots of medical texts where they give you very specific ingredients to put on a wound, or they'll tell you which god to repeat the name of several times. And they were woven together. There was no distinction between that sort of material.
Interesting. Great. Well, this is fascinating stuff. It's a great little, as you were, I know at the end you were kind of just rushing through to kind of show the different images, but even as you were going pretty fast, I could always find the little, set of 4 there at the start. It's really neat to begin to get the very beginnings of a way to make sense of things. It's a really fun puzzle.
And once you see the person's name, it's a lot easier to go find the characters that represent their names in a text. So I feel like it's rewarding because you feel like you're getting pieces pretty soon that you can actually use on real world texts.
Right. Cool. Very neat stuff. Any final thoughts or questions from other folks, from other attendees?
I'd just like to say that if people decide to sort of pursue Egyptian, it's a pretty rewarding start. It's pretty, it's not sort of stressful, and it's sort of made, most of the textbooks and stuff are sort of made to be introductory at first, to sort of really give you a reward. And it's fun. There's lots of cool little pictures, and you learn a lot.
Yeah.
And the
It looks
glosses,
absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
the glosses looked like they were consonantal. Still something that's a part of Old Egyptian.
Sorry, can you say that again?
I said the glosses that you were given looked like they were consonantal, like PRT was one of them. No vowels.
Yeah, I actually can't remember. That one I just remember. So I don't remember. There's 4 different ways of sort of categorizing these. Most people sort of adopt James Allen's, but I can't remember what category he would fit into, like that distinction that you're making.
Yeah.
For the first few modules, it wouldn't matter, I think, for most people.
Having learned a bit of modern Arabic, it just seemed normal.
And it's related, so it's distantly related to Arabic, to Hebrew, to Aramaic, things like that. So people will recognize aspects in there. It's part of a larger family.
This looks absolutely fascinating, Shawn. I mean, I'm loving the fact that you can actually start to pick up the patterns once you understand that there are patterns in there. Because when you showed us the bit with the plant, the first thing I started doing whenever you showed a new piece was I was looking straight for the plant. I think that would be really helpful for the beginner to see all these different patterns that you've already started showing us. Thank you for this.
You're welcome. And most of these were sort of randomly chosen. It wasn't even pulled to represent that. Like, this is a fairly random sample. So this is what you can kind of do across the board if you have the right texts. If you have ones dedicated to this, it's even easier. And the sort of last piece is that, so people, when they study language, right, so there's a variety of topics that you can work within. Like, you might do literature. For Egyptian, there's a pretty big variety, and there's a lot of topics that people don't normally think about. It's becoming popular now, but it wasn't for the last 100 years. There's a lot of people that study Egyptian demons, which is a pretty cool thing. Like, oh, what do you work on? Like, oh, I'm a demonologist. And it's a fairly large field, and you can read those texts, once you've gotten a little bit of Egyptian under your belt. So it's not just like, well, you have to read these stories, but you can read, magical texts, things like that. So it opens a big variety. But I'll be quiet.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you for this. This is a really neat little glimpse, and I know there'll be more chance to dig in more deeply in in the first of your hieroglyphics modules, which we're offering for December. So thanks, Shawn, for joining us for that here this evening, and for offering that in December.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, so
I will stop my share.
Okay, very good. Hey, I'm excited. We got screen sharing to work, so that was a step forward. I didn't even know that. So here we go. Like, we're learning things. Everyone learning things all day long. That's the beauty of things.